Welcome back. Today's story filled with drama and unexpected turns. Hit like, subscribe, and let's jump in.
I didn't have much growing up, but I had Sophia. She was the only one I loved from when I was 7, starting school, until 2 years ago when someone took her away. We both grew up in the hills of Arkansas, in big families with too many kids and not enough money or food. Our dads said they were farmers, but they mostly just stayed home, drinking and spending whatever money they or our moms could find. Our small, old houses were never new. We wore used clothes, either given to us or bought from thrift shops. Dad's old truck broke down more often than it worked, and if you saw our houses, you might think they were empty buildings in a junkyard. Even the dogs and the skinny chickens roaming around looked wild and hungry. When the truck did work, it made loud noises and smoked like it might catch fire, and sometimes it actually did. If it broke down, it stayed where it stopped unless Dad could afford to fix it. Without the truck, we walked or got rides from others until Dad saved enough money to buy another old, barely working truck. We didn't even have enough money to get rides from places like Easy Auto Finance. I know you've seen kids like us, or at least pictures of kids like us, threadbare clothes, dirty faces, messy hair, and that hollow, hungry look. We were always hungry and scrawny. Sometimes our stomachs would growl loud enough to be heard from the front of the classroom. School got so rough that a couple of our early teachers would bring food from home for us. Of course, we qualified for the free school lunches, and later, the free breakfasts too. You better believe Sophia and I took full advantage of those. We always ate seconds if we could, and we'd eat any food our few tablemates left behind, if we could talk them into it. We especially loved sandwich days. We were amazed that so many kids disliked some of the food and threw it out. If the food was dry enough to carry, we'd take anything our friends didn't want with us when we left the lunchroom. Sometimes we had so many leftovers, we'd have to scrape together a bag to carry it all, but we made it work. The so-called pizza burgers, and whatever else other kids claimed tasted like unflavored cardboard felt like manna from heaven to us. If we could scrape up enough, we'd even take it home for later, but usually, if we did that, our families ate it all. So we usually tried to eat as much as possible before we got home. Sometimes we actually gained a pound or two during the school year. I don't know why, but from that first day of school, Sophia and I were a team. Being poor and not one of the pretty people made us a target for bullies. We rode the same school bus, and by the time we got off, we were already the butt of jokes and nasty remarks. I followed her off the bus, as my mom had taught me, gentlemen let ladies go first. Hey, we were just poor hill folks, but my mom tried to teach me to be polite, especially to ladies, and to me, even back then, Sophia was a lady. When Sophia left the bus that first morning and headed toward the school, one of the older boys and a couple of girls started making fun of her worn-out dress and the patches on it. I could see the tears in her eyes as she tried to walk past them with as much dignity as she could muster, even though we didn't really understand what dignity was back then. The boy sneered and stuck his leg out to trip her. When Sophia fell, one of the girls laughed and sneered, "Oh look, the little ragamuffin can't even walk across the yard." I took 2 running steps and slammed into the boy who tripped Sophia, my head knocking into his face as he hit the dusty ground. I watched him for a minute to see what he'd do. I was already familiar with our brand of rough and tumble fighting, and even as small and young as I was, I intended to give it my all if he wanted to take it further, even though he was half a head taller and about 20 pounds heavier. But this time, he just lay there in the dirt, rubbing his bloody nose. When he saw the blood, he jumped to his feet and ran toward the building. I knelt down beside Sophia, helped her up, and tried to brush the dirt off her dress. I took out my handkerchief, wiped her tears, and dabbed at the blood from her scraped hand and knees. I let her keep it since her scratches were still seeping fresh blood. About that time, a teacher rushed up to the group of kids still standing around, watching us. He grabbed me by the arm and started dragging me toward the building, saying, "You little punk, we don't allow fighting and bullying in this school. Keep this up, and your days here are numbered. Now, come on, it's the principal's office for you." I tried to tell him I didn't start it, that I was only helping Sophia, but he didn't listen. Sophia, still crying, followed us to the office, but they wouldn't let her come in with us. Even though it was just the first day of school, I got 2 swats with the paddle. This wasn't one of those schools where they weren't supposed to spank a kid. Here, they didn't hesitate. I kept myself from crying, though I felt tears well up, and my backside burned with the sting of the paddle. When I left the office, Sophia was waiting for me in the hallway. She gave me a small, sad smile, came up to me, and took my hand. The teacher who took me to the office walked away down the hallway, leaving us with another teacher who said, "You two, come with me. You're already late for class." She took off down the hallway, moving fast, almost too quick for us to keep up as she led us to our classroom since we didn't know the way. As she handed us over to the kindergarten teacher, I heard her say, "You need to watch those two troublemakers." First thing they did off the bus was get into a fight with Dr. Carter's boy. They even had the nerve to blame him for starting it. Well, that was pretty much a picture of our early life, and a good description of the rest of our school days. We were a team of two and had each other's backs from that day on. Sure, we each had a few friends over the years, but none were close. We didn't have the money to do things in town or attend school events, and we had no way to get back to town if we wanted to go. Even if we could, none of our so-called friends ever stood up with us when the bullies came around. They were the children of more prosperous farmers or families who lived in town and had enough money that we thought they were rich. When Toby or one of the other bullies approached, our friends would vanish in an instant. I never knew if it was because they didn't want to face the bullies or because they didn't want to upset the town's elite. Sophia and I only lived about a mile apart, as the crow flies, but it was uphill both ways, as the saying goes. By road, it was a little over 2 miles from one house to the other. During the summers, we spent a lot of time together at each other's houses. We both had chores, but many times we worked together until she got older and started changing. We used to fish and swim in the nearby creek, but once Sophia started turning into a real girl, she got shy with me. We still spent as much of our free time together as we could, but we stopped skinny dipping and some of the other things we did when we were younger. The summer we graduated from high school, Sophia and I did what everyone expected and got married. We were so in love and so happy together, it should have been illegal. We both tried to find work so we could set up a home, but luck wasn't on our side. I found a part-time job at a local repair shop, and Sophia waited tables at a small diner 8 hours a day. We barely made enough to put food on the table. We were living in my old bedroom at home, and Dad made us pay him $150 a month in rent and buy our own food. I noticed, though, that everyone ate the food we bought and didn't replace it. None of us ever seemed to have money left by payday. Our car was just like Dad's. It was old, worn out, and smoked like a busted tractor. One hot October Saturday, Sophia and I made a bunch of sandwiches and headed for the old swimming hole. If we were lucky, none of the other local kids would be there, and we'd have some alone time. When we got there, we found a small group of kids, but they left soon after we arrived. After a while, we went swimming, made love, and then lay on a blanket, talking. I said, "Sophia, I've been talking to Jordan. He's been in the army for almost 4 years now, and he says he's got it made. He's making nearly $2,500 a month on his own, and his wife's got a job on base, bringing in another $800. I talked to the recruiter, and he said I could start at around $1,700 a month. After I get my initial training, you can come with me, almost anywhere they send me. Heck, together we're barely making what Jordan and his wife do on just one paycheck. I think I should join up, but I won't if you don't want me to." Sophia looked at me, her eyes wide like she was going to cry, but she didn't. She just gave me that little smile and hugged me tight. Then she pulled back, wiped her face with her fingers, and said, "I don't know, Ethan. That is a lot of money, but what if they send you overseas? You could get hurt or killed. I don't want to lose you." "Sophia," I said, "it might be a little dangerous, but at least we'd live better. Plus, the recruiter told me I could get $350,000 in life insurance for you. If anything happened to me, you'd have more than you'd ever need." She punched me hard in the arm and said, "I don't want that money, Ethan. I want you. You're all I've ever wanted since we first went to school, and that's a fact. But if you think it's what we need to do, then I'm for it. You're my husband, honey, and wherever you go, I'll go, just like the good book says." So, we talked it over some more, and I went back to the recruiter and signed up. That basic training camp wasn't as tough as I thought. Some of those city boys groaned like it was killing them, but to me, it was easy. Heck, we got to sleep in until 4:30 each morning, and most days, we were done by 1700 hours, that's 4 in the afternoon, for you civilians. Sure, sometimes we went into the woods to do soldier stuff, but it was fun. We got to shoot things, blow stuff up, and drive some of the neatest equipment I'd ever seen. After my training, they sent me overseas for 18 months. I spent my deployment in Afghanistan and Syria, then came back home to the States. When we got off the plane, there was Sophia, standing and smiling just like I remembered. I won't go into that first night home, it's none of your business, but let's just say we made up for lost time. After what they called stand down, my unit got back to regular duties, but I didn't get to stay in it for long. The Army decided I needed to go to another base, so they sent us to Fort Riley, Colorado. They packed up all our things, sent a truck, and paid for the move. By then, we had a decent car, so I drove us out there. We moved into a nice house on base, and things were going great. I was a specialist by then, an E4, making decent money. My paycheck was $2,400 a month before taxes, and on top of that, I got extra money for food and free housing. I was making more than Sophia's and my family's put together back home. About 3 or 4 months after we'd settled in, Sophia wanted to go into Austin one Saturday. I had duty that weekend, so I said, "Why don't you wait, honey? We can go in next weekend." "No," she said. "A couple of the other wives and I want to look for Thanksgiving presents. We don't need you guys watching what we buy." I could see I wasn't going to win that one, so I just kissed her and said, "All right, but be careful. We've heard about all the crime in some parts of Austin. Promise me you'll stick to the safe areas." She smiled and said, "Don't worry, honey. Hannah's driving, and she and her husband go into the city all the time. She knows where to go." That Saturday morning, I kissed her goodbye and went off to duty. I made her promise to call me when she got there, when she was leaving, and when she got home. She rolled her eyes at all my check-ins but agreed, knowing it was just because I cared. Her first call came just fine around 11:20, they'd made it to Austin and were going shopping. They planned to shop a while, have a late lunch at a Tex-Mex place they'd heard about, and then look around some more before coming home by 8. But by 8 that night, I still hadn't heard from Sophia, and I was starting to worry. I tried calling her phone a few times, but she didn't answer. Finally, at about 8:15, I looked up as the door opened. I jumped up, dropping the clipboard I'd been reading. The battalion executive officer and the command sergeant major were walking into the orderly room, and a chaplain was following behind them. The major said, "Specialist Miller, I have some bad news. Your wife, Sophia, was killed in Austin this afternoon. I'm sorry, son. If there's anything you need, just let the sergeant major know. We'll get someone to relieve you and help you make arrangements." I just stood there, numb, feeling tears roll down my face. Someone was screaming, and for a moment, I didn't realize it was me. I felt a firm hand on my shoulder and heard the sergeant major's voice saying, "We understand, son. Calm down now, we have things that need to be done." I collapsed back into my chair, sobbing. This time, I heard the sergeant major say gently, "Son, I know it hurts, but you have to pull yourself together. Let's get you home." They took me back to our house, and a few people came inside with us. I couldn't believe it when I saw Hannah and her husband standing there, bruised and scraped up, looking guilty as hell. Hannah ran up to me, crying, and hugged me, saying, "Oh, Ethan, I'm so sorry. They tried to attack us, and it's all my fault. I took a wrong turn trying to find the restaurant and ended up in a rough part of town. When I tried to turn around in a warehouse lot, a group of men came out yelling and waving guns. They dragged us out of the car and into the warehouse," she continued, her voice shaking. "They were moving packages into trucks when they noticed us. Sophia saved us, Ethan. She kicked one of the guys and got him off me, then helped us get free. She ran for the car, started it up, and we all jumped in. She drove through the warehouse door and out onto the street. They shot at us as we were getting away, but we thought we'd made it." Hannah took a shuddering breath. When we got onto a main road, Sophia slumped over the wheel and drove off the road. She'd been hit, Ethan. She got us out, but they shot her. I don't know how you can even look at me. It's all my fault." I hugged her while she sobbed, feeling numb as her husband looked at me and said, "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I'll never forget how brave Sophia was. If there's ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, just ask." I spent the rest of that night listening to everyone's stories, barely processing what I was hearing. Later, we watched the late news, and they had a story about it. A suspected cartel was using that warehouse for a drug operation. Apparently, Sophia's car smashed into one of their trucks, making it impossible to move, and she'd run over two of the men. The police had shown up soon after and found a lot of evidence linking the gang to several crimes. They were investigating, but none of it mattered to me. I'd lost Sophia. Like the good book says, an eye for an eye. Those people took her from me, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I can't complain about how the army treated me, though. They took care of all the arrangements. Before long, I was on my way home with Sophia for the last time. We had a simple funeral, the kind where the whole town shows up, and I got more hugs than I could count. By the end of the 2 weeks, I was bruised from all the back pounding. But eventually, my leave was up, and I went back to Carson. Nothing about it felt the same, though. They told me I'd have to move out of our house since I wasn't married anymore, and they put me in the barracks with the other lower-ranking soldiers. I had about 18 months left on my enlistment, and I started saving every penny I could. I was surprised when the captain called me into his office not long after I got back. He told me the army was promoting me to sergeant, E5. It was unexpected. Imagine that, a country boy like me, promoted to sergeant. Guess I'd have to talk a little better now. With the promotion and missing Sophia so badly, I quit going out with the guys. Instead, I spent all my time learning everything I could about fighting. I found a couple of old-timers, crusty sergeants, to teach me, and I trained in unarmed combat, working out nearly every day. I even found a few guys who had some special operations training, and they helped me learn things that aren't taught to most soldiers. I told them why I wanted to learn, and they didn't ask any more questions after that. One afternoon, the battalion command sergeant major called me into his office. He looked me over and asked how I was doing after Sophia's death, saying he'd heard I was putting in a lot of extra time at the gym and the training fields. Then he leaned back and looked me dead in the eyes. "Sergeant, I hear you've been learning combat techniques, going out into the hills to practice patrolling and infiltration on your own. I'd hate to see you do something that could get you in trouble. Do I make myself clear?" I felt a tightness in my gut. If you've ever had a command sergeant major angry at you, you know the feeling. I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, Sergeant Major." Clear as day. "Good," he said, "because I have some friends I want you to meet. Go to supply and ask for Master Sergeant Brown. He'll have something for you to do." He checked his watch, then grinned. "You have time to make it if you leave now." I left his office, went straight to the supply office, and asked for Master Sergeant Brown. When I walked in, there was an older guy sitting behind a desk, leathery skin tanned from years outside. He stared at me without saying a word, sizing me up. Beside him was a mountain of a man wearing sergeant first-class stripes, muscles on top of muscles, barely fitting into his uniform. The big guy looked me over, then nodded at Brown and said, "The kid doesn't look half bad, even if he's a regular infantryman. He's got some muscle on him. Let's talk to him and see if he'll do. If he's up to it, we can run him through his paces." I stood there silently, waiting for them to speak. After a moment, Brown leaned forward and said, "So, Sergeant Miller, tell us why you're spending all your time learning how to fight and, from what we hear, how to kill." My stomach dropped. I knew then I'd slipped up, made the kind of mistake no one making plans like mine should ever make. Trying to sound calm, I said, "I just figured since I'm a sergeant now, I need to know everything I can to train my squad. Since Sophia passed, I don't have much else to do. I'm just trying to better myself." They both let out a laugh, and Brown shook his head. "Relax, kid. We know exactly what you're doing. You've made one mistake, though. You're doing your training too publicly. If anything were to happen to a certain gang in Austin, guess who they'd come looking at first? You need to stop being so obvious about your dislike for those slime balls, and start training out of sight. Tell those old rangers you've been working with that you've moved on, let off some steam, and don't need their help anymore. Am I clear?" I swallowed, realizing these men knew more about my intentions than I'd thought, and said, "Yes, Master Sergeant, clear as a bell." Brown nodded. "Good, because this isn't over yet. From now on, you'll report to us every evening after duty. We have a few things for you to do that'll likely take up your weekends, too. Any issues with that, Sergeant?" "No, Master Sergeant." No issues, I replied, though I knew full well they were setting me up with some unofficial, extra duty to keep me busy. They dismissed me, and I headed over to the gym to meet the guys I'd been training with. They weren't happy when I told them I'd been ordered to quit, but they got it. One of them muttered, "Damn hillbillies don't know how to keep quiet. You've probably got the whole command watching us now." The next evening, I reported to Brown as ordered. He and Sergeant First Class Taylor were waiting with a Humvee, and they told me to get in. We drove out to a training area, and Brown threw a duffel bag at me, ordering me to change and meet them near a small storage building. Inside the bag were old, worn-in combat clothes, likely from another era, but they fit. What those two men put me through made everything I'd done with the Rangers look like kindergarten. We started each day with a 10-mile run, followed by nearly an hour of bodyweight exercises. After 2 weeks of that routine, they began teaching me all sorts of close combat techniques, ways to survive in the field alone, and other things soldiers don't usually get taught. Not once did Brown or Taylor look like they were even breaking a sweat, no matter how hard the training got. They were some of the toughest men I'd ever seen, and they kept pushing me to my limits. Brown gave me books to study at night, and soon we were going on field exercises with some other units. I don't know how they got my direct supervisor to allow it, but one day, my CO called me in and said, "Sergeant Miller, you're on special detail for the command sergeant major. Report to him when required." After almost 3 months of training, Brown, Taylor, and I sat around one evening, drinking a couple of beers. Brown looked at me and said, "I think you'll do, kid. We've been tough on you, and you haven't slacked once. You ever think about going for a Green Beret?" I shrugged, not wanting to give anything away, but then Brown continued. "Look, I know you're hurting. My brother's wife was killed, and he went off the deep end. He did something stupid and ended up in prison. Told me he felt better knowing the men responsible would never hurt anyone else, but he wished he'd been more careful." Brown leaned forward, locking his eyes on me. "We've taught you everything we can, and we hope you'll use your head if you're planning something. Maybe you'll pull it off. Maybe not. Just remember what we've taught you. And make sure nothing you do reflects badly on the Army. We wouldn't like that." I felt a chill down my spine, realizing how closely they'd been watching me. Brown reached into a box and pushed it toward me. "Here's some gear that might help. Don't get caught with it. If you do, you don't know where it came from. Just say you got it on your own." After that, I'd sometimes find little gifts left for me in training areas, a bit of extra equipment here and there. Some C4 and other things found their way to me too. I knew some of it was surplus they'd managed to claim during exercises, but I wasn't going to ask questions. Instead, I stored my stash carefully and moved it off base whenever I could. 5 months after Sophia's death, I'd tracked down one of the men I believed was involved. I'd followed him for a couple of nights, watching as he moved between bars and clubs, dealing. One night, I followed him out of a bar and tailed him to a shabby neighborhood, nearly down by the river. He parked outside a rundown house and went inside, barely even glancing around. I drove by, acting casual, then parked around the corner, killing my lights. I got out, moving quietly, slipping up to the house in dark clothes and a mask. I peeked through a window and saw him sitting in the living room, counting cash. I crept in the back door and moved up behind him. In one swift move, I had my arm around his throat and silenced him for good. I grabbed his cash from the table, made a quick exit, and headed back to my truck. When I got back to base, I counted what I'd taken, over $6,500 in cash. It wasn't a huge amount to the cartel, but it was more than I'd usually make in 2 months. I continued doing my job during the day and watching the gang's movements in town during my free time. So far, the police hadn't locked up anyone for Sophia's death, and I was beginning to doubt they even cared. Finally, the day came when I was discharged from the Army. I'd missed the stability, the steady meals, and the pay, but I had things to take care of now that Sophia was gone. I set up camp outside of town, moving my campsite every couple of days to stay under the radar. Over the next couple of months, I tracked down and took out a few more low-level guys whenever I needed money, being careful to mix up my methods so no one would catch on to a pattern. But I wasn't interested in these small-timers. I wanted the guy who'd been there when Sophia died. I started following the money van that picked up cash from the dealers. It didn't take long to track it to their main warehouse. The place was heavily guarded, with rough-looking men everywhere. After a week of watching, I noticed a routine. Every night around 4:15, a van would arrive to load up a couple of big suitcases of cash, and another van would arrive later to pick up narcotics for the night's operations. In the late afternoon, the dealers would show up to collect their night's inventory. Then, the whole cycle would start over. I followed the money van to 3 more stash houses before it finally went to a big warehouse in the industrial district. The van drove inside, and I got a glimpse of what was going on through the open door. There were men milling around, some in suits, others in street clothes. The place was crawling with guards. I kept observing over the next few weeks, taking pictures whenever I could and figuring out the layout. One night, I decided it was time to go in. It was a cloudy, moonless night, the perfect cover. I waited until the money van had just picked up its last load for the night. I set up a little fender bender at an intersection. When 2 of the guards jumped out to confront me, I took them out quietly, then dragged their bodies back to the van. I laid down plastic to cover the seats, loaded the bodies, and drove straight to the warehouse. The guards at the warehouse recognized the van, and one of them opened the gate without a second thought. I drove in slowly, scanning my surroundings. Through the windows of the offices, I could see men counting money, a few others drinking and watching TV, and several high-level guys talking in a back room. Just like I'd seen in my surveillance. I knew I might not get out of this one alive, but I couldn't let that stop me. I grabbed a couple of grenades and tossed them into the offices, then pulled out my pistol and went hunting for the guards. The grenades exploded, sending shards of metal flying and causing absolute chaos. A couple of the guards huddled behind a van, so I lobbed another grenade under it, watching as the blast sent it flying. They wouldn't bother me anymore. Moving through the building, I fired at anything that moved. A few men stumbled out of the office with the TV, coughing and bleeding from the explosions. I put them down quickly, then moved to the back office where I'd seen the boss. He was slumped in his chair, not saying much anymore. In the counting room, there was cash everywhere, piles of it. I stuffed a few bags with the cleanest bills and took a few more bundles that weren't too badly singed. Then I rushed back to the van, bullets flying as I ran. 2 of the outside guards came around the corner as I jumped in the driver's seat, and I fired through the window to keep them at bay while I peeled out of there. Just as I turned onto the main road, I heard sirens in the distance. I ducked into another warehouse complex, cut the lights, and hid behind a building. Once the fire trucks and police had passed, I got back onto the street and drove back to my old truck. I left the van and bodies where I'd found them, loaded the cash bags into my truck, and got back to my campsite just as dawn was breaking. I felt like I'd just come out of a firefight in Syria. I burned the bloody plastic and checked my haul. One of the bags alone had over $7,000 in it, and I had 4 more bags. This cash would last me a long time, but I knew better than to let myself feel too safe. Over the next few days, I stayed low, keeping an eye on the news. The police were calling it a major drug bust, saying they'd uncovered over $3 million in cash, a large stash of narcotics, and 14 dead men linked to cartel activity. The news anchor mentioned the gang's connection to the death of a young army wife in Austin, but I wasn't too thrilled to hear it. If I'd missed anyone, they might come after me. After about a week, I loaded up my bags of money and my few belongings, and I went back home to Arkansas. The army had already shipped my things back for me, and they were waiting in storage. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back, I just drove until I got there. I arrived in town one afternoon, around 3, and didn't even stop. I just kept driving out to the family farm. It still looked like a dump, but somehow it hit me harder this time. After living on army bases, I wasn't sure how they could stand it. When I pulled up, my 2 youngest brothers and my little sister came running out, shouting. Mom followed, wiping her hands on an old dish towel, a weary smile on her face. "Ethan. What are you doing here?" she asked as she hugged me. She was so thin I could feel her bones. Her hair was almost completely gray. "Didn't know when I'd get here, Mom. They let me out of the army, so I just took my time getting back." "Oh, Ethan, please don't tell me you're out for good," she said, looking worried. "There's no work around here, son. I thought you'd stay in the army." "I was planning to, Mom," I said, "but things changed. I had some things to take care of that the army wouldn't have liked." Well, come on in, then, she said, leading me inside. Your dad's out somewhere. I don't know when he'll be back. I've got some soup warming on the stove if you're hungry. I laughed, looking around the same shabby kitchen I remembered. Same old, huh, Mom? You all doing okay? Mom sighed and sank into her chair, glancing around the kitchen. Yeah, I suppose. At least with most of you kids gone, we're doing a little better. The little ones aren't as skinny as you all were growing up. But, well, I do wish things had been different. She looked down, then back at me. Do you know what you're going to do now that you're home? Not sure yet, Mom, I replied. I saved up some money in the army, so I have a bit of time to think it over. I might buy a little land. Oh, Ethan, don't do that. The land around here's terrible, you'll barely scrape by if you try farming like we do. I want better for you than this. I hugged her and said, We'll see, Mom. I'm just going to take things one day at a time. Dad didn't come home that night, but that wasn't anything new. Around supper time, Mom set a bowl of soup in front of me and the kids. It was so thin I could see the bottom of the bowl, and there was one small piece of meat and a few vegetables floating in it. We each got a piece of cornbread and some water to drink. I was still hungry afterward, but I didn't say anything. I hadn't told her I was coming, after all. That night, I barely slept in my old bed. In the morning, I came into the kitchen, hoping for breakfast. Mom handed me a small cup of coffee and went back to stirring something on the stove. Soon she set out a bowl of oatmeal for me and the kids. She just drank her coffee and watched us eat. I looked around for milk or sugar, but there wasn't any. I opened the fridge, it was almost empty. I checked the cabinet for sugar, and it was almost gone, too. I looked down at the 3/4 full bowl of oatmeal, then back at Mom, who avoided my gaze. Mom, I said softly, there's no food here, is there? Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, pressing her lips together. I pushed my bowl toward her, then got up, pulling my wallet from my pocket. I looked at the kids and said, Get in my truck. Now. Mom started to protest, but I cut her off. We're going into town, and I'm buying breakfast. Then we're getting groceries. But Ethan, we can't spend all your money. We'll get by, we always do, she said, trying to brush it off. We're not doing this, Mom, I said firmly. Get in the truck. We're going to town, and we're going to have a decent meal, and then we're getting groceries. Mom opened her mouth to argue again, but then she sighed and gave in. All right, Ethan. We drove into town and headed straight for a small diner. When we got inside, I didn't let them order. I ordered for everyone and made sure to get the biggest breakfasts they offered. Mom and the kids ate like they hadn't had a real meal in days, and I don't think I'd ever seen anyone drink as much coffee as Mom did that morning. By the time we finished, she actually looked like she was smiling a little. Next, we went to the grocery store. I grabbed a cart and started loading it up with everything I knew they'd need: bags of beans, rice, flour, cornmeal, sugar, canned goods, anything that would last. I even grabbed some meat for them, although I didn't go overboard since we'd always hunted for most of our meat. Mom tried to protest at every aisle, saying we didn't need this or that, but I ignored her and kept loading up. When we got to the checkout, she saw the total and tried to make me put some of it back, but I just handed over the cash. Hell, I was using the money I'd taken from the cartel. I hadn't counted it all yet, but I'd gone through one case that had over $200,000 in it. If the rest were similar, I had close to $1 million in cash. I could certainly afford to buy my family a few groceries. When we got back to the farm, Dad's truck was parked out front, and he was sitting under the tree with a beer, already half drunk. He looked up when we pulled in, then scowled when he saw the groceries. "Where the hell have you been, woman?" he barked. "It's almost lunchtime, and you don't have anything started yet." Mom looked at me, then at Dad, and said, "Ethan took us into town for breakfast, and then he bought us groceries." Dad just sneered. "You've been holding out on me, haven't you? I asked you for money a few days ago, and you said you didn't have any. So where'd you get the money for all this?" Mom stood her ground. "I didn't buy it, Tom. Ethan bought it with his last army paycheck. He's home to stay, looking for a place to buy." Dad let out a laugh. "Buy land? You know how much ground costs around here? 1,300 an acre, sometimes more. You think you're gonna buy a piece of land with no job? I looked at Mom and the kids carrying bags into the house, then back at Dad. I think I'll manage, Dad, I said, forcing a smile. He leaned back, took a long swig from his beer, and muttered, "Well, there's not much room here for you, son. You can have your old room if you need it, but we can't support you. You'll need to chip in for food and $150 a week for rent, just like before. I'll count these groceries as part of it, but I need the cash soon." I felt my temper rise as I looked around. Mom and the kids were barely scraping by, and here he was, drinking away money that could have fed them for weeks. But I held it in. I wasn't planning on staying, Dad. I'll be looking for my own place soon. After that, I spent the rest of the day at the farm, then drove into town to camp by the river. It took me nearly 2 weeks to find a piece of land that felt right. The realtor finally showed me a small farm about 170 acres, with a stream running through it and an old barn that wasn't in terrible shape. The house had fallen down years ago, but there were a few meadows for livestock and some woods with good hunting. I went to the bank to ask about a loan, but they turned me down flat, saying I had no job and no way to make payments. I figured I'd have to dip into my stash, even though I knew it would look suspicious. That night, I called one of my old buddies from Fort Riley, Logan, Hannah's husband. After we caught up, I said, "Logan, I've got a little problem. I need to buy some land, and the bank won't give me a loan. Think you can help me out?" Logan hesitated. "Ethan, you know we don't have a lot of spare cash. We're barely scraping by with 3 kids now." "No, it's not like that," I replied. "I have the money. I just need a way to explain where it came from. I came into some cash a while back, but I don't exactly have a way to show it. I was wondering if you could back me up, maybe say I won it playing poker while you were with me." Logan was silent for a moment, then said, "Ethan, you didn't happen to be involved in that gang bust right after you left the army, did you?" "Logan, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to sound casual. "I won the money fair and square, just like I said." He laughed softly. All right. I won't say anything, and if they ask, I'll say you won it playing poker. But Ethan, be careful." The next day, I told the realtor I had cash but needed some time to gather it. The old couple who owned the land agreed to carry the note for me, bypassing the bank entirely. We set it up so I'd make a small down payment, and over the next few months, I paid them off in cash. By the end of it, I owned the land outright. They took off for Florida, and I was left with a small farm, an old barn, and a few less boxes of cash, but it was worth it. I set up a little room in the barn, put in a wood stove, a small table, a good chair, and a cot. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. When I needed to blow off steam, I'd head into town and find a barfly for a night, but other than that, I kept to myself. No other woman could hold a candle to Sophia, and I wasn't interested in anything serious. The farm kept me busy. I spent most of my time fixing up the land, working on the barn, and setting up a garden. I managed to scrape together enough for a few chickens, some goats, and eventually, a couple of pigs. The little stream on my land provided enough water for my small garden, and with hunting and fishing, I managed just fine. It was a quiet, simple life, and for a while, it felt like the right place to be. But the memories of Sophia never left me. I'd sit by the stream some nights, looking up at the stars, thinking about all the plans we'd had together, the dreams we'd shared. I'd think about those cartel guys who took her from me, and a dark anger would settle in my chest. I told myself that I'd done what I could to even the score, that the men I'd taken out paid for what they'd done. But I knew deep down it wasn't over. There were still men out there who'd been part of that operation, and they were still running free. One evening, I got a call from Logan. He'd heard some news about the cartel starting up operations again in a neighboring town. "I don't know if it's the same group, Ethan, but I thought you'd want to know," he said. "They're recruiting new guys, expanding their territory. Thought maybe it'd interest you." I thanked him for the call, and after hanging up, I sat on my porch for a long time, watching the sun dip below the hills. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't about to let them come this close to my home, my family. Not after what they did to Sophia. Over the next couple of weeks, I started preparing. I went back to the places where I'd hidden some of the gear Brown and Taylor had left behind for me during training, and I carefully loaded what I needed into my truck. I drove around town and neighboring areas, gathering supplies and equipment, making sure I wouldn't be caught off guard. The first night I went out, I kept it simple, just gathering intel, learning their routines. I found their main operation set up in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, much like the one in Austin. They had guards posted around the clock, but I knew their type. They'd get bored and sloppy when they thought no one was watching. After a few days of watching them, I began to see the cracks, the times when their shifts overlapped and left them distracted. I made my move on a cold Friday night, slipping in through the back. I kept to the shadows, moving silently, just like Brown and Taylor had taught me. Inside, it was almost a mirror image of the operation I'd taken out before: stacks of cash, crates of drugs, and a handful of guys doing inventory. I waited until the van they used to make deliveries pulled in. As soon as they opened the doors, I struck. With quick, practiced moves, I dropped 2 guards at the back and moved through the warehouse, clearing the place out one man at a time. The firefight that broke out lasted only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the last guy hit the ground, I took a quick inventory of the room. I grabbed whatever cash I could find, tossed it into the delivery van, and made my way out. Driving back to my farm, I felt a weight lift off my chest. This time, it felt different, like a part of Sophia's memory was finally at peace. I unloaded the cash into the barn, but the money didn't mean much to me. It was just a reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd given up to make things right. Over the next few weeks, news of the raid hit the local channels. They called it an unknown vigilante strike, linking it to recent arrests of lower-level cartel members. The police had a few leads but nothing solid, and I made sure to lay low, keeping to my routines, tending to my farm, and spending time with my family. Mom was proud of how I'd fixed up the place, even if she didn't fully understand why I'd chosen such a solitary life. Dad didn't ask too many questions, content to know I was around if he needed a hand. As time went on, I realized that I'd done all I could. I'd made my peace, as much as anyone in my position could. The anger had dulled, replaced by a quiet acceptance. Life on the farm was simple, but it was honest. I'd built a place Sophia would have loved, somewhere we could have called home. Thanks for watching. Do you think Ethan found peace, or is his journey far from over? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.